have our colleagues here and our partners at ANHD. And just a couple housekeeping things. If you can go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat box if you're here, your name, your preferred gender pronouns, affiliated org or role. A fun fact about yourself, if you will. If you're on the phone, please don't worry. We will do our best to make space for questions and open it up to both folks on the phone as well as in the video and in the chat. And we'll be doing our best to monitor the chat box and answer questions as you all are slating them in. But again, being mindful of everyone's time, we're going to be here for a couple hours. We have a short break built in, but we're going to be sharing our screens. So from this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to other folks. I'm going to go ahead and actually hand it off to Atul, who's going to start off today's training. Let me just quickly share my screen so I have this ready for you all.
All right.
Thanks, Atul.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, first I'm going to go over what open data is. So lots of times people ask us where these tools we're about to present to you, who owns what, and Displacement Alert Project, where they get their data. A lot of them assume that it's somehow crowdsourced, like volunteers somehow give us the information or something like that. But in fact, all of this, all of the data that's in these systems is built upon data that the city provides openly. Sometimes it's referred to as open data. Could you go to the next slide? Oh, there we go. And so this idea of making data data open to the public is something that is actually not a super new idea. You can see here that this is a paperback book published in April of 1993, and the spirit of this goes even further back. Could you go to the next slide? The idea that government activities should be, quote, open traces in part back to New York City in the early 20th century, when progressive era reformers fought for legal remedies to the corrupt ward politics and favors trading power brokerage characterized by the Tammany Hall political machine. So it was really about holding our public servants accountable. And so that basically morphed into the Freedom of Information laws, that were passed in the 1970s that basically granted the public access to state-held data on like an ad hoc per request basis. But then around 2010, could you go to the next slide? Yeah, so in 2010, Gail Brewer, city council member, signed into or proposed a law that basically tried to take that law, the FOIL law, one step further. So rather than responding to specific requests for public information on an ad hoc basis, the city the law was proposed that the city will require itself to publish data, all data, just outright, and people at the time sort of questioned, like, what will they actually use this data for? Like, why is this actually useful? And the answer is, like, tools like this. Like, tools like this simply would not be possible. The tools that we're about to present to you, WOW and DAP, would simply not be possible if not for the efforts of public servants like Gail Brewer and other folks in the city to make all of this stuff openly available. So it's definitely flawed information. There's definitely gaps in it, as Lucy will talk about in a little bit. But it simply would not exist if not for the city. Could you go to the next slide? Thanks. And so this is just like a little look at what some of this data comprises. Back in 1993, you could actually like buy floppy disks that contain some of this data, as this page on the left shows. In 2020, you actually just go to a website, and you can see at the very bottom of the screenshot, there is, it says table preview. So essentially every one of these little pieces of open data is basically like a spreadsheet, like in like an Excel spreadsheet, if you're familiar with that. It's just tabular data, and ultimately through a series of various programs that that the Housing Data Coalition has created. We essentially ingest all of that into a database and basically just sort of like, you know, crunch all these numbers and to process that data and ultimately make these tools like WOW and DAP. Can you go to the next slide? Of course, there are definitely wrinkles in open data. Like, you don't want to make all state data completely public. An obvious example of this is census data. Due to privacy concerns, full census data, such as like name, like where you were born, like who you're related to and all of that, obviously that's extremely privacy sensitive. So full census data is only made public 72 years after it has been collected. So this photo is from the 1940 census, which was made public in 2012. And so, like, as I don't know if you noticed, but 2 slides ago, or in the previous slide, like, it was basically housing complaints. So it's like, obviously that's kind of privacy sensitive. You obviously don't want to give like information on like the name of the person that made the complaint. But there is specific information about like the address and even the apartment number that made complaints. So there are some like privacy concerns in here, and that's why some gaps in open data exist, is because it would be really nice to know, to have like this full complete picture of everything that's going on in housing, in housing court, in everything related to tenants' rights, that's based on data the city has, but it's not always easy to address the privacy concerns. So could you go to the next slide? So as an example, there was an article in the New York Times less than a year ago about how, like, all of these companies that have released, quote, anonymized data sets, it's actually possible in various ways to actually correlate a bunch of these different anonymized data sets and ultimately essentially actually identify people based solely on things like gender, like their zip code and date of birth and things like that. So it's just to say that it's not super straightforward. It's not just a matter of like, oh, we'll just like remove their name or something like that, and therefore it's anonymized. But some civic groups like the Housing Data Coalition are working with the government on opening up some of this data, like the New York City Housing Court's case data, without putting tenants at risk. Which is really great. So these gaps are systematically being addressed, which is nice. Yeah, and that's about it for an overview of open data.
Awesome, thanks, Atul.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So I'm gonna pick up where Atul left off. Just talking briefly about some of the gaps in open data. We have pretty good open data laws and an open data program in New York City. There are thousands of data sets on New York City's open data portal, and there's been a lot of progress made since the original law passed in 2012. So like compared to other municipalities and geographies, like we're really, really strong. For example, New York State has an open data law, but you just like absolutely don't see the same like robust data sets on there. And that's because there's really like a lack of enforcement, a lack of will at the state level, whereas at the city level, you have a mayor's office behind that's like invested in this, that pushes other agencies to make their data accessible, and there's like continual updates to the open data laws. So in New York City, if you can make the case that something doesn't need to be protected for privacy, there's a good chance of getting it made available. And we've seen data sets open up over the time that we've been working on this. New York State is a different story. So like everything that we would want from the Division of Homes and Community Renewal on the housing front is basically inaccessible to us. We really want their numbers on registered stabilized units. We want data on major capital improvements. We want all kinds of data of theirs. It's absolutely not made available. So it's a big gap, and it requires us to figure out ways around it. There's also kind of different different jurisdictions and agencies making different kinds of calls about what privacy concerns need to be covered or not covered. So Atul mentioned that like HPD data sets that are available will have unit numbers on them. So will the data set that's published by the Department of Investigation, the DOI, on evictions executed by court-ordered marshals will have like unit numbers on it, whereas the Office of Court Administration at the state level will not. You know, that data is like very inaccessible. And even in New York City, where there's pretty robust enforcement and drive to get this out there, there will be big inconsistencies across agencies in how they identify properties and how they identify buildings, things like the data type they use that just make it difficult to link things across data sets. So even if it's out there, it might not be very simple to link up and work across data sets. And that's an issue, but it's one that is surmountable. So what we've done on the housing justice advocate front is we formed the Housing Data Coalition a few years back, and this is a bunch of people who are invested in using this data to stop speculation, to stop tenant harassment, stop displacement. And so we have collaboratively developed resources to be able to work easily across those different agencies and data sets, but it's a significant barrier to working with the data. So, so having that kind of like consistent quality is important. And then, you know, when it's not there, we either address it with a workaround, and if the data is not available, then it requires pushing and advocacy. So Atul mentioned that that we're working on getting housing court data from the State Department, from the State Office of Court Administration, which is it's a big push to get them to give that test. But those are the kinds of roles that the Housing Data Coalition plays.
All right, so we're going to be showing you two different sort of data-driven tools today, and I think we just wanted to kind of frame these demonstrations right off the bat as just talking about sort of the similarities and differences between these tools. You know, there's a lot of different online tools and projects that people work on that involve open data and involve housing data specifically, and I think it can get really confusing what the differences are and also who is kind of responsible for which kind of tools. So the tools we're going to show you today are DAP Portal, which is an ANHD tool, and Who Owns What, which is built by JustFix. These are both built, you know, by us, which are NYC-based nonprofit organizations. And we do belong to this larger network of groups called the Housing Data Coalition, which is essentially a volunteer group that meets once a month and is a mixture of individuals and also representatives from different nonprofit organizations that talk about strategic ways to use and get access to housing data for anti-displacement work. So we do coordinate together in spaces like that, but these are tools that are maintained by two different, you know, organizations. That being said, they both rely on the public data from NYC Open Data that Atul and Lucy just discussed, and they are intended to make housing data clearer and more organized and more accessible for, you know, anti-displacement work in New York City. And so that, you know, that's kind of the similarities and why people, I think, sort of think they're part of the same thing, but it also is important to also see what the differences are. And so if Analisa, if you go to the next slide, it's important to see what the differences are, not only just for your own mental framework, but also to think about how things can be used together. So, you know, we really try not to duplicate work. And so in terms of the values that these different tools can have for you, those can sometimes like lie in two different buckets. So Who Owns What, as we said, is maintained by JustFix. The main piece of value that Who Owns What can give is really looking at data on a building and then an estimated landlord's portfolio, you know? So if you're looking to see what other buildings, you know, your building's landlord owns, Who Owns What is the place to go for that, because we're really doing a lot of analysis looking at connections between buildings that have common ownership. It also, the other thing about Who Owns What is that it's a tool that really provides more of like a snapshot or recent history of a building. So if you're kind of looking to see what conditions are like right now, or like what's the state of a landlord's portfolio right now, that's the place for that. DAP portal on the other end, so as we said, it's maintained by ANHD. It includes data both at a building level like Who Owns What, but then also at different geography levels. So you can look at data for different council districts, community districts, sort of more looking at the larger big picture of these like larger areas around the city. And also DAP portal shows more of an exhaustive history of data. So if you want to look at like the sale history of a building dating back 12 years, DAP portal may be more of an appropriate tool for stuff like that. So I know that's just a little bit of a tease, and we are going to get to going into these tools more in depth after the break, but this should just give you a general framework to think about how these tools kind of relate to each other.
Thanks so much, Sam. I'm gonna pass it over back to Lucy, actually.
Okay, so as you know by now, we're going to be demoing these two tools. So Sam is going to go over Who Owns What, and I'm going to be going over DAP portal. We're also going to be talking about the ways that you can use these tools in very complementary ways. There are certain ways that one kind of flows into the other and vice versa. Before we get into it, it would be really helpful for me and Sam to know what kinds of housing data research questions you all tend to have and what you came to this workshop wanting to know. I have some questions. I'm going to post them in the chat, but also say them. So kind of guiding questions. And it would be great if you want to throw these in the chat box, and then we can also leave some time for people to chime in out loud, especially those of you who are on the phone. But the questions are, what are some examples of housing research questions that you often have? What information do you need quickly to work with tenants, or if you are a tenant? And what questions do tenants ask you that you scramble to find answers to? So far I'm seeing it has become a lot harder to see if a building is in 421A or J51 now that DOF changed their portal. Information on landlords' violations of certificates of occupancy. More info on names associated with LLCs. What are the most significant DOB and HPD violations? These are great, very detailed questions. These are excellent. So feel free to keep putting these in the chat window. Does anyone, especially who's on the phone, want to chime in with any questions you have?
And if you're on the phone, just remember to unmute yourself with *6 if you're having trouble. We'll do our best to mitigate any talking over each other, but feel free.
So far, these are great. So in addition, we have when was the most recent purchase? What is the history of violations in the building? Who is the managing agent, and do they have significant ties to the assigned broker? Construction date and history of vacate orders. Any others? I know it can be intimidating to speak up on a webinar with 100 people on it. So feel free to keep adding these as we go. So we'll keep an eye on the chat window. And we're going into a wow, and then we'll take the break, is that right?
That's correct. I'll just pop up my screen share shortly. Thanks everyone for your great questions. So compiling some of them in the slide deck here. We'll make it a little bit more visual as we continue going on. And I'll pass it over to Sam.
All right. So yeah, appreciate everyone's questions there. I think I'm really glad to see that a lot of those questions feel very relevant to these two tools. So hopefully a lot of those kind of questions of how to access this data will be answered through these two different demonstrations. But I am here specifically to give you a demonstration on the Who Owns What tool. So if you go to the next slide, Analisa, please. Who Owns What is a tool that unveils property ownership patterns in public housing data. That is kind of the core of this tool, though it does do some other things beyond that. Essentially, the problem that we're trying to solve here is that, you know, as a lot of folks on this call know, different landlords around New York City will register their property with pretty meaningless LLC names that makes it really hard to track what the true owner of a property is and also what other properties they own. This is a particularly relevant problem for tenant organizers who are trying to organize around a specific landlord. And it's also, we want to make it clear that this is not a new problem, right? Like I've talked to folks that have been, you know, been in the tenant movement in New York City for decades, and this is something that they've had to do for quite a while. And the issue with that is that given the way that these records are set up, it's an incredibly time-consuming process to try and generate a landlord's full portfolio by jumping through all of these loops of how they disguise themselves. So this tool really just seeks to automate that process. And so it can be a really quick and easy thing that you can do. You can just search an address and then just see a list of all the other buildings that are associated with that. Beyond that, we try and provide other data and information that might be helpful to give you a general sense of what the current conditions and recent history of that building or that particular landlord's portfolio that you're looking at is in. And so if you go to the next slide, Analisa. So I think it's most helpful just to dive right in and give you a demo of the actual tool itself. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen and do that. Let's see. All right, this should be it. All right, can you all see this?
Yes.
Okay. So hold on. Let me just quit out of my other apps here. My computer's kind of on its last leg, so having other apps open sometimes crashes it. Let's hope that doesn't happen here. But basically, if you go to if you just Google it, you can find it easily, or you can find it on JustFix.nyc, our website. This is the landing page for the tool. And something that I should point out, this is not the actual live URL. This is a URL that we use just for demos. So just wanted to point that out. And as you can see, the kind of entry into this tool is very self-explanatory. You just enter an NYC address and you'll find other buildings that are associated with that. And down here, you can also see some sample portfolios. So like we've picked some portfolios that we think are really, you know, noteworthy. So if you wanted to just like look at how the tool works, you can go down here, but I'm actually going to show you how the search feature works. So if I search in an address, and I'm going to search this address in Queens, 4125 K Street in Queens. You search that and it takes about a second. And now we're brought to the overview tab. And so this is where you can see an overview of both the building that you search and then a map of all associated buildings that have, you know, common ownership records. Important details of this page are definitely at the top here. You can see just some general statistics about the building, when it was built, how many residential units are in it. You can also hover over each of these boxes and see a little description that explains what that data point is. This is, you know, open HPD violations, total HPD violations. We use executed evictions from the Department of Investigation. So we have that for 2019. It doesn't seem like there are any evictions here in 2019. And then we also use this open source project called Tax Bills that estimates rent stabilized unit count. And so that's how we're able to show you this change in rent stabilized unit values here. This uses tax bills from the Department of Finance, and it's actually a project that scraped like different numbers off of those PDF documents to see to estimate how many residential units existed in different buildings year to year. And so that's how we're actually able to grab these numbers here, even though that's not something that's currently published on open data. Down here is helpful. So this all comes from the HPD registration information that is on open data. You can see a list of business entities listed as, you know, registered with this building, and oftentimes these are pretty meaningless. So you can see the business name is 4125 K Street LLC. It seems like an incredibly local company that owns this building, but when we look at the business address, we see that it's totally in a different borough, right? This is 1065 Ave of the Americas. And so that's actually the business address that the property owner registered when they registered as the owner of this building. You can also see the people involved. So the head officer is usually what we consider the person principally involved with the ownership of the building. You see that's Donald Hastings here. Contact names like agent tend to follow along with management. That also seems to be Donald Hastings here. And so this is actually part of a larger portfolio called, the company's called ANE. And they're actually one of the worst evictors last year. And so this is one of the portfolios that we use as an example. So that's the overview tab here. You can also see when the property last registered with HPD, and then also link out to some, other websites, most of which come from the city. So you can link out to ACRIS, HPD's official page, which usually takes about 20 or 30 seconds to load, just as a warning to you all. DOB building profile, Department of Finance tax bills, as well as the ANHD DAP portal, which we'll get to later. And then there's the map here, and the map is fully interactive, so you can sort of zoom around. Let's kind of look at the area that we're in here. We can see that there's a cluster of other buildings that are, part of this portfolio right in this area, but, zooming out, there's buildings associated all over. And the cool thing is you can click on these points and actually then it'll change the detail view to look at that. So I clicked at this other building, 4140 Denman Street. And we can actually see this new link pop up. How is this building associated? This is a really useful tool that I think not a lot of people would notice, and that's kind of on us to make it more clear. But if you click on this, this is after you've searched a building and then go look at something else. If you click on this, it'll actually show you how we link these two properties together. And so you can see here, this is the original address that we searched. And then this is the new address that we picked. They have totally different businesses that claim to be the owner, but you can see it's the same business address. And we can also see it's the same contacts involved with this. And so this kind of elucidates how we're actually making these connections by matching up common business addresses and then common owner contact names within the open data. And so, you can feel free to explore the map. A lot of people use the map and will, target specific areas and look at stuff. But there's a lot more to this that exists in these other tabs up top here. So I also encourage folks to explore those. So if I go back to our original search address, which is this dark red dot here, we're back where we started. Now I'm going to actually go to the timeline tab. And the timeline tab just is designed to give you a brief recent history of different data indicators. So the default view here actually looks at HPD complaints. So these are housing complaints called in by tenants using 311. You can kind of see how these have rose and fallen over the last couple of years. You can change the view. So it currently shows you just by like quarter of a year, but you can change it to view by month and the graph will update to show you that. You can also look at it by year. And so here we can see this building was sold to the current owner on December 2013. And pretty much since then, there's been a steady increase in HPD complaints in this building. We can also look at HPD violations here, which seems to be more variable, as well as building permit applications. And so that's kind of what this tool is for, is just to get a general overview looking at trends in these different data indicators over the recent years. That's pretty much it for the timeline tab. We also have the portfolio tab, which looks just like a big spreadsheet, right? This is more of just like an exhaustive list of all the data that we have. And this is for the whole portfolio. So you can see here, there's 148 buildings that we found associated here. You can see their addresses here, different, a lot of the information that you can find on the overview tab. And then there's a couple of other things here. So we include, this is actually a new feature that we added. We include the last sale information here. So if there is a deed on ACRIS that does have, that corresponds to a building in this portfolio, we'll list it here and we'll list the date of that sale. We'll also list the amount that it was sold for, and we'll also link to the deed itself. So if you click on this, you can actually see the scanned copy of the deed that this data is referencing. We also will say whether this is part of a group sale or not. So sometimes buildings will be bought kind of as like a bundle, and so we wanted some way to indicate that to you all as well. And then the cool thing here is if you find a building that you want to look at more in detail, you can click on the View Detail button, and it'll actually bring you back to the Overview tab, but now you're looking at that new building. And so that's what the Portfolio tab is like. It's pretty simple. And then the last sort of tab that we have is the Summary tab. And this is just bringing you summary statistics across the whole portfolio. So now we're outside of just the realm of looking at one building and looking at like, okay, how does this whole portfolio kind of compare when you're looking at it compared to others? And so, you know, here you can see how many units there are, the average age of the buildings. I know someone brought up trying to find out who like the most common names associated with the portfolio are. That's what we list here. So you can see in order what the most common contact names that appear in the HBU registration are for the entire portfolio, as well as the most common corporate entity name, which oftentimes, yeah, it doesn't really have a key meaning here, as well as the most common business address. We look at kind of the average number of violations per unit and compare that to a citywide average. Surprisingly, this is actually better than the average. We also tally up the amount of evictions that happened in the most recent year. So in 2019, there are 76 evictions. We say also what building had the most evictions within the portfolio. And then we also track that change in rent stabilized units across the whole portfolio, which you see at the bottom here. One other important thing, and I think we're going to return to this at the end, but on the Summary tab, we include this button called Send Us a Data Request. And this links to a Google form that you are all welcome to fill out. This is something that I respond to, and basically if there's anything, any piece of data or information that you feel like you had a hard time finding on Who Owns What or just simply doesn't exist here, you can feel free to use this Google form to request that information, and that'll actually be sent to my inbox. And twice a week, I'll go through and respond to these requests and try and help you out as much as I can. And so this is something that exists in case you can't find what you're looking for on Who Owns What. But those are kind of the just main features of Who Owns What as a whole. There's a couple of smaller details that I can show you right now since we have time. This is an important feature here, the export data button. This is, once you search an address, that shows up in the top right corner. This is a way, if you want to basically just have a spreadsheet of all of the data that we have on this portfolio, kind of like what you find in the Portfolio tab, you can go to the Export Data button and click Download, and then, you know, open it up in Microsoft Excel or use it as a, you know, CSV file wherever you would use a spreadsheet elsewhere. And so that's something that a lot of folks make use of. If you're curious about sort of the history of the product, we have different pages here, like we have an About page that kind of talks in brief about sort of how the project came to be and how it works. If you really want to get into the nitty-gritty details, we have a link here to our methodology that spells out exactly how it works here. So we'll say exactly how we link properties together and where we pull our data from, if that's an interest of yours. We also have a how to use section that can guide you through different potential use cases for Who Owns What. This is especially interesting for sort of new users who don't necessarily know where to start. And then the other thing I'll just show you as well is, you know, I showed you an example of a building that is registered with HPD, and that is the core of where, like, the kind of data analysis that we do. That being said, you really can search for any New York City address, and I sort of wanted to show you some examples of what that looks like. For, you know, as I know a lot of you work with HPD data a lot, buildings that are required to register with HPD don't represent all buildings in New York City. They specifically represent buildings that are residential properties and are either have 3 or more units or don't have the owner or an owner's immediate family member living there. So there are a couple buildings, like 1 or 2 unit buildings where maybe the landlord lives in 1 unit and then a tenant lives in the basement, that aren't technically required to register, and therefore we don't have public data on who the owner is to use for this method. And so those buildings are not gonna necessarily show up here. They're not gonna give you a big portfolio map. And so I'm gonna show you an example of what that looks like when that comes up, because it can be a bit confusing for people. So This is an address that doesn't have registration. So you'll see when you search, you'll say no registration found for 75 Hendrick Street. And it'll give a little explanation. So it seems like this property doesn't seem like something that should be required to register. And it'll list the building classification, which you can kind of take a look at here. So this looks like a one-family building here. And so that is something that usually is not required to register unless it's not owner occupied. But you know, it's not a total loss. We'll still give you a couple useful links here that you can look at. So if you wanted to look at the sale history, go to Acris here. But when you see a page like this, I just want to make it clear that that's what it means. It means that that property does not have registration on file with HPD at this current moment. Another special case here is NYCHA buildings. And so you used to actually get a page like that for NYCHA properties, which is pretty disappointing. But about a half a year ago, we added a special page for NYCHA properties that tries to give a little bit more curated information. So if I search for a NYCHA property, you can just type in the name of the development right into the search bar. So I'm going to go to this one here. And it'll, you know, tell you this property is part of a public housing development. We'll tell you how many evictions occurred there in the previous year, how many units exist there. And then we'll also try and give you some relevant contact information. So we'll list the borough management office for that NYCHA property, as well as the New York Regional Office contact information. And then we have a curated list of useful links here. So you can look at the NYCHA directory. You can go to My NYCHA app here. There's also the HUD complaint form 950H, which I know has been helpful to folks organizing in NYCHA in the past. But since this is not private housing, private residential housing, NYCHA properties are also not required to register under HPD's guidelines. And so we do not, that's why these are a bit of a separate case from the, you know, privately owned properties that we looked at earlier. Cool, so that's just a general overview of kind of the bits and pieces of what Who Owns What can give you on its own. Analisa, if we can actually transfer back, I think I actually need to stop sharing the screen, right? If we can just transfer back to the slides, we're gonna move on to a second section that actually shows you how to use Who Owns What and then migrate over to using ANHD's DAP portal. And so this is kind of where things get really exciting because there's a lot that you can do when you use these two different tools together. And I want to walk you through a couple scenarios that I think are really important to know about and I think can be really strategic and useful for using Who Owns What and then jumping over to DAP portal. And you know, this is also going to be a little preview of what Lucy's going to show you, which is a more in-depth overview of the DAP portal tool. But some of the examples that I'm about to show you are like tracking HPD violations in detail. So if you really want to look at individual HPD violations and complaints and stuff like that, Who Owns What doesn't give you that functionality. We just give you a little, you know, a brief history of what trends are like. But there's a way to use these together to look at those details more thoroughly. Also, something that we recommend to a lot of tenant leaders that come our way is actually using DAP portal to make connections with other tenants facing similar issues. And you know, some folks have tried to start a mailer campaign, and there are some ways that you can do that using these tools together that I think are pretty neat and interesting. And then the last thing I'm going to show you is looking more in depth at mortgages and other financial documents for recent building sales. And so I'm going to share my screen once again. Right, we're back here. And so the first thing that I mentioned was looking at complaints and violations in detail. So I'm actually going to go to the sample portfolio here. And so, you know, a common sort of practice when folks are trying to investigate a specific landlord and maybe like find buildings within the landlord's portfolios that are in a particular distressful situation right now. A great way to start is with Who Owns What, because it just gives you the general overview of the portfolio and we'll get this list of buildings for you right away. And so, you know, let's say you're looking into this landlord right now, you're looking into A&E and you're looking into this portfolio. You know, a lot of things that folks do is we'll go to the portfolio tab and here you can actually sort by these different categories. So I would probably want to find, okay, what are the buildings that have like the most open violations right now? Like that's pretty important information for me to know. So I'm going to click right here and sort by open violations and find which ones has the most. And so we can see, okay, this one, 7261 150th Street, they have 109 open violations. That's pretty intense. I'm going to scroll over and actually view this building in detail here. And from here, you know, we only see a list of, you know, we only see the count of open violations here. We don't actually know what these are. If we go to the timeline, we can see like, you know, we can see a visualization of like what the trends have been like, but we still don't have a way to see what these specific violations are. And so what we can do is scroll over to one of these useful link boxes and click on ANHD data portal. And the great thing about those links is it carries over your address with you. So we can actually see here that we have the same BBL code that we had with the property over here. And we can go and click on a bunch of these different categories here to look at this data more in detail. And I know Lucy's going to give a more in-depth demonstration of this. But if we click on HB violations here, we can see, you know, a much more detailed list of what this HBD violations data looks like. And so we can see the most recent ones here. We can see the apartments where the violations were found. And then we can also filter by open. So if I click on open violations, we can see which ones are currently open. And then in the description, we can click on that and see exactly what kind of violation there were, what kind of violation took place there. A really nice feature that I like about this too is if I just wanted to search for heat violations, I could search heat here. Oh, it looks like there's no heat. There's no violations that reference the word heat. Let's try hot. Okay, so we have two here. It says there's a hot plate being used for cooking in the kitchen. There's nuisance consisting of hot water exceeding the allowable temperature. It doesn't seem maybe like there's any heat related violations, which, you know, I guess makes sense given the timeline here, but that's a way that you can filter for specific kinds of violations by a certain keyword, which I think is really interesting. And so that's how you do that. And you can do the same thing for HVD complaints here. It's structured slightly differently, so these actually have more detailed categories. I know folks mentioned DOB complaints, DOB violations, the same thing goes here. But this is just kind of a flow that you can use when you're trying to look at a landlord and look at specific buildings, but you want to go in more detail with this HBD and DOB violation data. That's how you can use the two tools together to do that. The other thing, so this I think is kind of a different kind of use case here. Instead of actually looking at data, if you're actually trying to make connections amongst different tenants, if you're a tenant yourself and you want to find other tenants who have similar issues to you, again, you can use the portfolio tab to try and locate different buildings that seem to be in distress or seem to be in a similar situation to yours. You can go click on view detail for one of those buildings, and then you can click on the ANHD data portal link for that. And right where we were before, you can go back to HBD violations, and here you can actually look at the apartment numbers here. And so, you know, we actually have had tenants come to us and saying like, I'm trying to start a mailer campaign. I'm trying to start like a borough, like a citywide tenant association for buildings owned by my landlord. I don't really know how to start. This is one way actually to start a mailer campaign where you can find the apartment numbers of tenants who have called in issues and tenants that have gotten violations to be issued in their apartments. So you can look at this in HDD violations. You can also look at it in complaints. They have the apartment number here. And then you can also download this as a spreadsheet, just like you can do it on Who Owns What. And so this is one thing that we've recommended to tenants in the past who are trying to make these connections and find, you know, other tenants in their building and other buildings, even if they're across the city, that have their same landlord and are potentially facing similar issues. This is one way that you really can, safely find other tenants' information. And in a way, also although this doesn't give you an exhaustive list of like apartment numbers across your landlord's entire portfolio, it is a way to potentially find tenants that are engaged in calling 301 and are engaged in fixing issues, and as I said, similar issues to ones that, you know, someone else might be facing. And so that's, you know, another way that you can use Who Owns What and then jump to DAP portal to, you know, solve another problem that you're trying to solve. And then the last thing I wanted to show you was looking more in detail at financial information. And so as I showed you before, in the portfolio tab, we give you this little snapshot of what the last sale for each building was. That, you know, is helpful for some things, like if you're trying to find like the most recently purchased building, you can sort by date here and see, okay, this is the last building that was purchased in November 2019. You can sort by amount, and you can link to the deed, but sometimes you want to look at the mortgage, sometimes you want to look at multiple deeds. Maybe you're trying to see how frequently the building was being turned over in terms of property transfers. That's something that you're going to want to use DAP portal for here. So let's say we want to look at this building here, we can click on view detail. And again, click over to the ANHD DAP portal link. And now we see a full list of financial documents, both deeds and mortgages. So we can see the deed that we reference on Who Owns What here. We see a bunch of other stuff. So we can see the most recent mortgage here. We can see which parties are involved. And then we can also click on these document IDs to view the details of this document on ACRIS itself. And so this is a way to get more in depth looking at like the financial and ownership history of a particular building using these financial documents that I find really helpful. And then also someone mentioned looking at J51 and 421A status. That's something that you can also do with DAP portal. And I know, Lucy, I don't want to kind of steal all these different things away from your demonstration because I know that you.
Again, I have plenty to talk about.
Okay, good. But you know, while you're looking at this financial information, you might as well look at you know, the tax exemptions and abatements that your landlord is receiving in this particular building's case, and then you can actually go over to programs and statuses here. And so you can see, oh, this was receiving a J51 tax incentive at some point. And you'll also find 421A here as well. And I know maybe there's also stuff that I'm missing, but I'm sure Lucy, you'll cover that. But yeah, this is just yet another way where you can use DAP portal to extend your research in Who Owns What to look at things in more detail. All right, so that's pretty much it. I think, Analisa, we're saving questions for the end, right? So we're not going to actually have questions right now. Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry, we actually are doing pretty good on time, so happy to save like the next 5 to 10 minutes for folks to have questions. I'm seeing a question come through, I think privately to me. Let me pull it up. Oh no, maybe not. There was a question from Jenna that said, where to see beginning and end dates of exemption/abatement?
I think that's more of a question for DAP portal, right?
Right.
I'm not on mute, right? So for 421A and J51, I don't know how to find it since they changed their portal, but for other programs, which I can show you a few examples of, on our end, we have access to some of the end dates that we don't currently display on the portal. So I could get into that in more detail when we look at the portal.
Awesome, thanks so much. Does anyone else have any other questions about Who Owns What, about what you've been seeing on the screen from Sam? Sam, just to flag too, I had dropped in everyone's questions that Lucy had asked on slides 13 and 14. So if you want to revisit those, you can take a look. Otherwise, happy to also hear from anyone on the phone. Feel free to unmute yourself with *6 and go ahead and let us know if you have any questions about what you've been listening in on. Also wanted to note that we're happy to share the presentation, the slide deck. I believe that Jessica had mentioned she had shared it out, but we'll also include the link in any follow-up email as well. And of course, you can always access Who Owns What just by going to the URL, which is actually found at JustFix.nyc. You can pull it up by dropping in your address, or you can go to whoownswhat.justfix.nyc. And yes, Jessica noted that if you go to housingcourtanswers.org/events, you'll see the slide deck posted there, so you can also access it there as well. Any other questions, thoughts? Anyone want to share how they are already using WOW, or maybe you are excited about using WOW? Sorry, and also Who Owns What, we call it WOW. Maybe how you'll be using it in your community, in your building, with your friends, families, coworkers, colleagues. Feel free to drop in the chat box or unmute yourself and share. We'd love to hear about how people are actually applying some of this.
Hi. I just wanted to say thank you so much for creating this tool, because my team uses it probably every day. We do, well, in normal non-pandemic times, we do a lot of door-to-door canvassing, so it's been so helpful. We'll just choose a portfolio where we know that tenants are having issues, harassment, bad conditions, and it's just been amazing. So thank you.
Yeah, no, that's really great to hear.
Awesome. So excited to hear someone use it for their thesis. Really happy about that. All right. Any other questions, comments, thoughts, ideas? We'll take it all about WOW. If not, feel free to continue noting them down, throwing them into the chat box. But if that's good for the time being, we're going to take a break, because we're going to now get into the DAP portal after our break. So we'll take about 5 minutes. So if y'all can come back at 3:05 p.m., then that would be excellent. So feel free to mute yourselves, turn off your videos, and come back a little bit more refreshed at 3:05 p.m. Thanks again for being here with us. And I'm going to go ahead and bring us back together. Thanks again. If you have any further questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the chat. But for the time being, we're going to go ahead and dig into the DAP portal by ANHD with Lucy. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Lucy, just feel free to let me know when I should be moving some slides along. Okay, Lucy, if you're talking, I cannot hear you.
Oh no. Okay, yeah, I was talking. All right. So, again, I'm Lucy. I'm the Research and Policy Associate at ANHD, and that stands for the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development. So we're an umbrella organization. We have about 80 members citywide. I believe Housing Court Answers is one of our citywide members. And our members are nonprofits that work in neighborhoods across the city on affordable housing, equitable economic development. Many of them are community development corporations that develop affordable housing. We also have a lot of groups that do tenant organizing. And so DAP stands for the Displacement Alert Project, and that's a series of tools that we've developed over time to support a lot of different types of users, with over time like a major focus on tenant organizers, similar to JustFix. That's evolved over time, and I'd say DAP portal is the tool we've created that looks to have the kind of broadest audience and applications. And yeah, so separate organization from JustFix, we work really closely with them, and I'm really glad that we're doing this training together today. So you can go on to the next slide. So what is the DAP portal? So the Displacement Alert Project encompasses a few different tools. It also includes something called DAP Map and the DAP District Reports. But the portal is our newest tool. We released it about a year ago, and we released a redesign earlier, not this month, in May. So it's a really dynamic and interactive tool, especially compared to the last ones. helps us understand New York City's housing landscape, where tenants and homeowners are at heightened risk of displacement and harassment, and what is happening in specific buildings where tenants or homeowners are having problems. And Dat Portal has 3 main features. So you can go to the next slide. The first feature is what you all saw that Sam was showing you. That's the property lookup, and that's where you enter an individual address that you want to look at, and you get all of these different data sets from a bunch of city agencies, really detailing all records that we have through open data on a property. And yeah, as we mentioned, it goes back historically. It has the most recent information possible. We update it on a daily basis. So data sets that are on open data and get updated daily, we also update daily, and then same if it's monthly, etc. And you can go to the next slide. The second major feature is the district dashboard. So this is the kind of neighborhood level view that Sam mentioned earlier. So Dat Portal is going to give you the option to look at a lot of different geography types. So you can search by community district, you can search by council district, state assembly or senate districts, and also by zip codes. And the district dashboard gives you options to choose from different housing types, different time periods. Sorry, I like it. The wind coming in through my window because it's so hot in here, so hopefully it's not making too much background noise. And then we have some default risk factors that we've set up for you to be able to kind of toggle on and off. And it's going to allow you to pick through some different options and get some quick kind of snapshots of what's going on recently in the neighborhood. And it's going to filter through all of the residential buildings and give you the results that meet the criteria that you put. So I'll take you through that. That, as I mentioned, has some default risk factors and options, but then, Analisa, could you go to the next slide? We have the third feature, which is the custom search, which lets you do basically everything in the district dashboard, but super specific to the exact time period you want to look at, combined with the housing type and all of the data sets that we have in the back end of the portal. So anything basically that's on property lookup, you can search, whereas on district dashboard, it's limited to the risk factors that we carried over from a previous tool called the district reports. And those are risk factors that we developed with tenant organizers as common indicators of harassment or displacement, especially in rent stabilized buildings. So those were sales, HPD complaints, HPD violations, DOB complaints, and DOB permit applications. So it's a kind of good set of risk criteria, but it's not comprehensive. So we also give you the option to search for many other options. So I'm going to, I think, take over screen sharing. I'm so sorry about the Mr. Frosty noise outside my window. I'm gonna have to grab headphones if it doesn't. Okay. Yikes. Okay, I'll take screen sharing, and then I need people to tell me in the chat if like the Mr. Frosty noise is just dominating everything.
So far, so good now.
I know it's stopped for now. I'm very worried. Worried that it's like parked right outside my window. Okay. These are the hazards of working from home, right? So, I'll share my screen. Okay, so forgive me while I take a moment just to set this up so I can do multiple things at once. So the website to access all of the DAP tools is displacementalert.org. And then from there you can click on that portal, and the URL for that is just portal.displacementalert.org. You'll get the landing page, which allows you to either enter an address or select a district that you're interested in. So I'm going to start off by entering an address. If anyone has, if If anyone has a building, if it's the building you live in or a building that tenants you know have been dealing with a lot of harassment in, feel free to enter in the chat box. If we have time, I'll explore that as an example as well. But this is 888 Grand Concourse in the Bronx. And you saw this already. You saw some of the data sets that you can look at. I'm going to start by showing you the, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to close my windows for the noise. Okay. Can deal with the heat for a moment. So on the left side of the screen, you're going to get the more kind of static information about the property, the stuff that changes much less frequently. So you have the BBL, that's the property identifier. You'll see a lot of these question marks around the website, and this is going to give you a little explanation of what the thing is. It's going to give you all of the different districts that this property is in, and if you click any of these, it'll take you over to the district dashboard for that geography. But it's also handy if you just want to know like which state assembly and senate district a particular building is in really quickly, you can use it for that. Gives you the total number of units, the number of residential units, and then the year the property was built. Very similar, if not the same information from what Who Owns What has. These are collapsible to kind of preserve space on the screen. And yeah, Mr. Softy's back. So we've got the rent stabilization numbers year by year. This came up in the chat window that these are the numbers we really want directly from HCR, and they won't give them to us so far. We keep pushing. Landlords are supposed to be registering their number of stabilized units every year, and DHCR takes that number from the registration, gives it to the New York City Department of Finance to add to property tax bills to collect a fee for administering rent regulation and overall that it sends back to HCR. So as Atul mentioned, we, not me, but people like Atul end up writing code to scrape those PDFs and get the individual numbers. So this is what we've collected over time from each of those PDFs. And these were numbers we were paying super close attention to before the new rent laws passed, because there was just this rapid destabilization of units. Something you can still look at to look at kind of the past landlord behavior. Is this a landlord that was trying to use individual apartment improvements to just deregulate as many apartments as possible? You can, that can lead you to questions about what they're going to be doing now if that was their money-making model before the rent laws passed. And you can also look at it in conjunction with the sale history to see, okay, this building turned over in 2017. And so is there a change after 2017? Or, if there was a purchase, if the building was purchased in 2012, do you see units being destabilized after 2012? And then was that building sold again? Or is it still in the hands of that owner that was doing that? Okay, so moving along, ownership. This is much of the same information that Who Owns What displays. This is meant to give you kind of a quick snapshot of what we know about the ownership. So these are the individuals that are registered. And then we also have the total number of properties that are associated with this property via JustFix's method of linking properties together. And then we have the owner on record with Department of Finance, which sometimes will be information that's not there in HPD. And then this links over back to Who Owns What. So when you're on a property, but you really want to know more about the landlord and the portfolio, you want to go to the ownership section and switch over to Who Owns What, and then you can, do the whole thing in reverse if you want. Go through the portfolio, find a different building, and then send yourself back to DAP portal for details on that building. You can just keep going in circles forever. Okay, so I'll go back to 888 Grand Concourse. Moving along. So this is where you have any type of tax exemption, abatement, subsidy program, regulatory program, a whole slew of different kind of government regulations applying to the property that makes it affordable housing or gives it special stabilization status. That's why we call it programs and statuses. So this doesn't have any subsidy programs on it, but we flag it because it was in AEP. And when it entered and if it's still active, and then this building or this property is also eligible for the Certificate of No Harassment pilot program. We'll also flag if a building is public housing in this section, and we'll flag if it is under 7A management. I feel like there might be another that I'm missing. We have zoning information for people who are deep in the zoning world and those battles. And then location, you have street view and you have the location on a map. Pretty straightforward. Okay, so back to the different data sets. You have all of the deed and mortgage related documents that you can filter. Using these filters, every data set you can change the amount you're viewing at a time, and you can also sort with these columns the way you can on Who Owns What. You can click here if you want to go to the actual ACRIS page for the property. So we include deed and mortgage documents, but not, there's a bunch of other stuff that gets filed via ACRIS. So that could have documents that we don't include. If you click on the document ID, it'll take you over to like a detail page for the property. And if you click this little icon, it'll take you to the actual scanned image. So document ID is, that's a great place to look. Sorry, I know I'm like clicking through things. I want to go to this $28 million sale, because let's say I see a really high sale amount and I want to know whether the sale was just for this property or whether it was packaged together with others. So I can click here, and down here in the parcels section, it'll tell me if there are multiple parcels, then they were all sold together. So that means that the really high sale price was actually for all of those properties. And then to see the actual document, I click on that link, the little icon. Every table in DAP portal has an export CSV button to export the results, and then you can open it up in Excel or another spreadsheet program. Every data set also has a question mark that's going to give you a lot of detail about what's included there and where it comes from. So you can see all of the different document codes we include. Marshal evictions, this is the evictions data from the Department of Investigations. So this is not housing court filings. This is evictions that would happen all the way at the end of an eviction proceeding if a marshal is actually ordered. HPD complaints and problems, you saw this earlier. So we link these together in a way that the HPD portal doesn't. You have to search separately to see the issue and to see the status. So here you can look at the status and you can see if HPD followed up, if they were able to access the building, et cetera. And the one thing that I want to mention and flag is that HPD currently only updates their complaints data monthly, which is less frequently than they update it on their portal. So that means that if the complaint happened in the last 30 days, I think, you might want to also check the portal, which you can go to from this link. I'm hoping that I think they're planning on switching over to daily updates, which I'm hoping they do soon. HPD violations, you already saw. You can filter for classes, you can filter for open and closed. As Sam showed, you can search using the description. One thing I wanted to mention is that someone asked if you can search by, if you can use those search words terms to filter through these categories and descriptions. You can't, but you can click on the sorting, and then you could, expand the number of results you're looking at the same time, so that way you can group things together and you can see patterns that way. So DOB complaints, similar deal to everything else. Filter by active and closed. DOB violations. These are usually more administrative type issues, whereas the ECB violations, Environmental Control Board, are the more kind of dangerous violations that carry penalties, and those go in front of OATH, Office of Administrative Trials and Hearings. DOB applications. So we have all of these. When it's available, we link to the document itself, so you can click on that and it'll send you through to the building information system. I was seeing some very specific DOB questions in the chat earlier, so this might be helpful for someone who's really deep into DOB. Something very annoying about DOB's system is that they won't list permits and other things chronologically always. So here you can look at it chronologically. Another very irritating thing is that they now take some permits electronically with their DOB Now system, and their open data for DOB Now is like terrible currently. So it doesn't actually give us a date associated with it. And it'll have this filing number, but you're gonna have to enter that filing number into the DOB Now portal to find it. I don't have an immediate solution for that, but hopefully we can make headway on it in the future. This goes back to the open data gaps. So we have the filings, we have the issued. Filings could be useful to keep an eye out for major capital improvements, the same on permits issued. And then, you know, construction as harassment is an issue, and that's where you would maybe want to look into DOB complaints. I feel like I could talk for a very long time about all of this, but the time that I have is limited. So we'll keep moving. Litigations against landlords. So this is data that comes from HPD, definitely not comprehensive housing court data. This is, but this is litigations that are filed by a tenant or by HPD against a landlord. It can also be like HPD obtaining a warrant for access, and they can't access the building for an inspection. You see one here, this is access warrant, non-lead. And yeah, when tenants litigate against their landlords, HPD will be named as a party. So that's how HPD ends up being able to collect those. And you'll see the respondent's name. This is also an example of HPD making data available that, you know, the state OCA would say, like, we're not gonna disclose anybody's names. There was a question, is the DOB data also updated monthly? I believe everything is daily from DOB. So you'll see here what schedule it's on. So complaints are daily, violations daily, 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 all daily. Sales are monthly. Complaints and problems are monthly. Everything else up here is daily, but not for closures. So for closures are special. We purchased this from Property Shark, and we protect it to protect the privacy of, for example, small homeowners who might be having difficulty paying their mortgage, and they might see predatory speculation from investors trying to buy up the house for cheap and flip it. We want to prevent enabling that. And so we put it behind an account. So all you need to do is request an account, use your organization email if you have one, and just outline what your organization that you're working with is, your position. If you say, like, I'm with this tenant association and I'm a tenant, then I would approve that. But basically, we're only looking to approve people who are using the data in order to prevent tenant harassment and displacement, or harassment and displacement of small homeowners, not for speculation or any related kind of profiting. So that's what we're looking out for here. So once you have an account, and I manually approve those. Once you have an account, you log in, and then this foreclosure data becomes available to you. In this case, there aren't any on the property, but I can show you some examples of being able to find properties that have those. Any questions before I move on to the other features, to the district dashboard and custom search. And I also wanted to ask Analisa for a time check, maybe in the chat or out loud.
Yeah, you've actually got a good amount of time. You technically can have anywhere from like 10 to 15 more minutes if you need that.
Okay, great.
I can save it for more open discussion at the end, so reflex.
Okay, wonderful. Apologies if I'm talking kind of fast because I feel like I'm trying to make it through a fair amount of stuff. Okay, so moving on to the district dashboard, I can use an example, or if anybody wants to volunteer a district that you work in or live in, I'm happy to do that. So if I want to use a community district, here's a feature where, say you want to look at your council district, but you have no idea what number it is, which a lot of people don't. You could say, I don't know my district, and then you could use the map to find it. You might have to kind of zoom in to figure out where you are. Okay, I'm not seeing anybody's district being volunteered in there, so I'm going to go to my council district. And here's what comes up is it has now loaded all of the residential properties in Council District 25. And then it's not going to display on the map yet because it has 10,000 results. So the map needs me to filter those down before it's going to show them all on a map. It doesn't really look like anything to see 10,000 points on a map, and it makes the page very slow. So I can change the housing types either by clicking in this kind of text box description, or over here on the left side in housing type. So let's say I only want to look at rent stabilized housing. So already this got to less than 1,000, so it's displaying on here. And these might be stabilized, partially stabilized buildings. There's a ton of co-ops over here in Jackson Heights. And then I can further filter with these risk factors, these data sets down here. So for example, I could click to look at recent sales. And I could say, just show me, let's see, this is showing me any property that had at least one sale in the last 30 days. Or I could switch it to the last year. And now it's displaying the 6 rent stabilized properties that sold in the last year. I can look at this on a map. I can also look at it on a table. And then it's going to give me each of those properties. I can sort them. I can see what the highest sale price was, the rent stabilized units. I can click this and it's going to take me over to the properties, the property lookup. And then I can go back to the dashboard. There's a question, can this be exported to raster data for use in GIS? If you export it, it's not going to export with like latitude and longitude coordinates. It'll export with the BBL and the address. So you would have to geocode the addresses or link it up with something like Map Pluto. And then there's another question. That portal can be hard to filter and then export from with only the filtered data. I don't fully understand that question. So maybe Jenny could elaborate on that. Okay, so I'm gonna show you a little bit more playing around with this. You can also combine these data sets in different ways. So you could look at properties, all rent stabilized properties that sold in the last 3 years. And I could say, what about like speculation? What about rent stabilized properties that sold twice in the last 3 years? Are there any of those? So you're getting sale amounts of $0, so those might not be like actual significant sales. They could just be transfers or like corporate restructuring. You can still check them out and see what's going on. So this one had, yeah, some big agreements and amounts, and I don't know what the story is there with a quick glance. We'll have to dig into those ACRIS documents to see what's going on, but that's an example. Back to one sale. I could look at properties that had a sale and also had a high number of HPD violations. So show me unstabilized properties that had at least one sale and at least 10 HPD violations, Or I could combine these in a different way where I say, show me properties that had at least 5 HPD complaints or at least 5 DOB complaints. So tons of different ways to combine these. Let's say I wanted to see if there are, there's a lot of speculation on small homes. I could look at small homes that have sold more than once in recent history. Here are, and I could look by latest sale price, $7 million. That seems outlandish. So I wonder if there's something up with that one. 2.6 also seems really high, could be commercial unit. And then I can also look for properties that had a foreclosure filing. So I'm gonna do and here. So these properties sold twice in the last 3 years and had a foreclosure filing. So this sold, looks like one of the sales was for $0. So maybe, oh my gosh, I feel like somebody else could interpret this a lot faster than me. I'm not sure. Let's see when the foreclosure filing's from. It's from February 2019, and the sale is from later in that year. So the property might have gone through foreclosure during 2019 and then was sold for $945,000. Go back to the dashboard. Any questions on the district dashboard before I move on to custom search? Okay. So custom search, as I mentioned, gives you a whole lot of different options of things to look for. So let's say I want to look at sales of rent stabilized buildings that have happened since the rent laws changed in June of 2019. So I'm going to pick rent stabilized. If I wanted to, I could define if there's been a change in the percentage of rent stabilized units since a certain year. I'm going to leave that off for now. I can define the number of residential units it has, and then I can select from all these different data set filters. So I'm going to go to sales. I'm going to pick the specific date. So it was almost a year ago. Yeah, June 14th. And then I can add a sale price amount. So I don't want those $0 sales. So I'm going to make this, I'll make it 100,000 because you won't really see a real sale of rent stabilized building for anywhere near that little. Okay, so I'm going to submit the search. And then here are the 3 properties we came up with. Something that can be interesting for doing research is like if you wanted to compare that to the year before it. It's been approximately a year since June 14th, we'll call that a year. But let's say we want to see the sales in the same district from 2018 to 2019 instead of 2019 to 2020. Oh, 3. Okay, so I was expecting a much bigger number for the year before that. And then just for fun, let's do the year before that. Granted, there aren't so many rent stabilized buildings in this council district. So 11 in the year before that. Anyway, that would be the type of research question you can do. Something that I was looking at since COVID hit was things like how many HPD violations have there been citywide since the beginning of the pandemic and lockdown versus the same time period last year. So I'm gonna do this, you can search by borough and citywide. It can take a while to run a query for citywide. So I'm gonna do just the borough of Queens. And I'm gonna look at all housing HPD violations since 03 16/2020. So even for a borough, it can take a little while to go through all those different properties. In the meantime, does anyone have any questions that you like, research questions or things that you would like to be able to figure out with this? Anything that you want to go through as a group? Analisa, 2 minutes sounds good. So here we've got 179 properties. Oh, I did at least 5 HPD violations. I wanted to do just 1. Okay, so I'm gonna leave that as an example. Basically what I did when I was researching this is I looked citywide. I looked at all the properties that had received any HPD violations in that time period. I compared it to the same time period a year ago. And I found that there was an 80% drop in the volume of HPD violations citywide. And then I compared that to the volume of HPD complaints in the same time period. There was a 20% drop. So the decrease in HPD violations was 4 times the amount of HPD complaints, which is really problematic because HPD enforcement is usually not sufficient. So for it to have gone down that much means that people might be living in really terrible conditions, although there are obvious reasons why HPD might not be making it out into buildings. So I'm gonna leave it there, and I can stop screen sharing, unless people have questions that you want me to answer with the portal up, but I'm not seeing any. So I'm gonna stop sharing. Yeah, I'm gonna leave it there.
Awesome, thank you so much, Lucy. We appreciate everyone's questions and all your time again. We're gonna close out definitely by 4 o'clock, so we just wanted to take some time as well to just discuss about a little bit more about how you all envision using these tools. I want to hear what you love about the tools, what more do you wish they could do. And actually, just before we get into some of those questions, I'm going to kind of let y'all simmer with those questions. I actually wanted to bring back a tool, if you will, a tool to be talking a little bit more about some of the pieces of the information that I think you wanted to cover in the very beginning. Are you ready to chat a little bit about that?
Oh, sure. I can talk a little bit. Lucy actually covered some of it. Yeah, one was that I just realized that I made it sound like all of the data that that these tools pulled in was open, in the sense that it was like kind of made available to us in this super easy to use tabular format. But as Lucy explained with the rent stabilization numbers, not all of it is. Basically, there is some data that we, I mean, I'm sort of imagining it as a thing where like a whole lot of the data is kind of, quote, delivered to us on a silver platter, so to speak, where it's like extremely machine readable, extremely accurate, extremely easy to cross-reference with other data sets. One of those things, for instance, that Lucy mentioned that can be used to cross-reference a lot is called the BBL, which stands for Borough Block Lot Number. I forget if that was mentioned before, but that's sort of like the equivalent of like a social security number for a building. It's like how buildings are identified in New York City. It actually goes way back. Its use goes way back to like the Civil War era. And like once you have a BBL of a building, that's really helpful because then you can cross-reference it with like another table that might be might have BBL listings. But you know, in some cases, like was mentioned with the Marshall's eviction data, like it just sort of has like a free form address, and we need to actually figure out what BBL those things map to. So there's lots of places in which this open data, there's sort of, you know, like you can almost think of it as like is like a grading to open data, where like some open data sets are super high quality and like get an A or something, where they're super accurate, have like BBL information and stuff like that. But then it sort of goes on this gradated scale towards like very, very hard to use open data, where it's like, oh, all this data, like technically this data that exists on the internet, but it's not made easy for machines to access. And it might not even be that accurate. So a really great example of that is as Lucy said, the rent stabilization numbers, where it's like there isn't a table of data that we can look at that says, oh, hey, for this building with this BBL, these are how many rent stabilized units it has. The most we have is that through some really annoying navigation on the Department of Finance's website, thanks in part to the redesign that they did like a year ago, if you click through certain things, you can get to a PDF file that is that tax property bill that DOF sends to all the property owners. And there's that, as Lucy was saying, there's like a $10 fee per rent stabilized unit that they charge for. And so we basically had to write a computer program that essentially navigated the DOF site, found this PDF, opened the PDF, tried looking through it, and tried finding this number on it. And that's of course its own kind of has its own possibility for errors, where it's like, oh shoot, for whatever reason our computer program couldn't find that number or something. But then also, like, for some other reason that we don't fully understand, sometimes a building might actually have rent stabilized units, but they're not being charged, but the owner isn't being charged for them, so they're just not listed on that thing. And so that's why sometimes there's a lot of variability in the rent stabilized numbers that show up on Who Owns What and DAP portal, is because we're essentially just looking at those PDFs. And because it's essentially, it's ultimately like this, really, relatively speaking, a very low quality open data set. It's you can only like as some of you had mentioned in the chat, like there's a lot of variability in it, and it's not always an accurate number. So these sort of gaps in open data, groups like Housing Data Coalition, like volunteers and stuff like that, essentially will try to create workarounds to fill in those gaps, and those workarounds aren't always as accurate as we would like them to be. So that's one thing that I wanted to address real quick.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Joel.
Mm-hmm.
And thanks, Lucy, for also mentioning the subsidy programs and custom search. For folks that are maybe on the phone, not on the chat, if you are also on the DAP portal, you can check out subsidized housing as an option in custom search, and the housing type to figure out the programs to select from and the properties that have programs. So I wanted to, as I mentioned, just hear from more folks on the phone, on the chat, about anything you've learned from the training, anything that you're excited about doing with these tools, ways that you envision potentially using them. Is there anything else that you wish that they could do? We've kind of cleared all the questions that you all have submitted, and done our best to touch on just about everything, but this is definitely a great point in time to just share anything else that needs further clarification. I think also if there's anything that we've covered at this point that you want to go back to, or just hear a little bit more about, please feel free to raise that. And I believe yes, I think if you are allowed to unmute yourself, so feel free to just unmute yourself and we'll figure out kind of what the stack is from there. I think on the panelist side, I would say if there's also any questions that you all might have while we have a very live audience, to help inform the tool, the work that you all are doing to continue to update and or improve in any way. Any questions that you all also might want to bring to the group?
I mean, I think my question is just, we got those were a great set of questions before we dove into the tools about how people would find it useful. So I'm just wondering if people have kind of this like if those questions changed or like what you would want from the tool has shifted at all after the presentation. Because I was definitely taking notes on what folks were asking for, maybe things that the portal can't do yet. It's always super useful to know like what is very critical to have in there to make sure that it's actually useful to users.
Did we do it? Did we just answer all the questions and take in all the ideas?
I know there were some things people asked about that just we did not, that our tools cannot do.
Okay,
Oh, housing court filings, I want to talk about those.
perfect. Go ahead.
Okay, so housing court filings has been like a not quite a year-long effort that I've been involved with yet. There are folks who have been dealing with this for probably decades. So as I mentioned, the New York State Office of Court Administration is the agency that manages that data. They're not covered at all by the state's open data law because they're in the judiciary branch. And the open data law only covers the executive branch. They're just old school and bureaucratic, and like they keep the data very, very close to their chest. Part of that is really legitimate because there have been, because the data has been used for tenant blacklists in the past. And there's a whole history of them selling the data to companies that would use it to create tenant blacklists. Now there are companies that go into housing courts and take pictures of the monitors to figure out who has been in housing courts. So they like still create those lists, and advocates don't have access to it. What we really want is those individual cases at an address level. We don't care at all about the names of people involved. We don't care about unit numbers. That's what we're trying to get a hold of and be able to make available in the tool. And we're working on that. Currently, we have housing court data by zip code, so we have it at a very aggregate level. We have it in a lot of detail at the zip code level, but not in a form that is very helpful to put on these two tools at the moment. If you're like really, really interested, you could get involved with the advocacy work we're doing, because we have kind of a campaign going on to push OCA to give it to us, and we're going to be continuing to try to get a hold of it.
Awesome, thanks so much. Any other last questions? Or Sam, Atul, do either of you have any questions for folks on the line? Well, we might have done it. Totally fine. We're really thankful, happy to give you all back a few more minutes of your day. So thank you all so much for joining us. Wanted to just quickly share a few resources again about where you can find some of the information that we've lifted up. Again, it's at the Housing Court Trainings page, but you can send data requests here. You can check out our Learning Center to find more how-to articles for how to tackle any questions of resolving issues in your apartment or building. Of course, you can visit the DAP portal here and see more trainings that ANHD leads, since I lead a greater set of trainings at this URL as well. And yeah, Lucy, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just on the slide before that, I have the URL to sign up for DAP updates, and I highly recommend that you sign up for those so that when we make updates to the tool and improve it, or have opportunities to weigh in and give feedback, that you catch those. We send out one email a month.
Awesome.
And if we do trainings, we'll announce them there.
Yeah. And we also highly recommend that you sign up for our email list. We're at JustFix.nyc, and yeah, y'all are going to hear it here first, but we have a very exciting announcement coming about who owns what. I don't know if you all know what this means, but I'm going to just drop the phrase, ¿Quién es el dueño? If you want to know more about what that means, you need to sign up for our email list, and you will find out probably in the next few weeks here. We're super, super excited about it. In any case, here's all of our contact information if you want to follow up about our organizations, these particular projects, other data request information, you know, tips and tricks on how to best navigate these interactive websites. Please do go ahead and reach out to us here. Yeah, actually, if we have one more minute, Sam wanted to quickly allude to my little teaser. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing and pass it over to you, Sam.
All right. Yeah, so this is a little sneak peek, and I'm actually curious, maybe some of you even noticed this when we were doing the demo of Who Owns What. So this isn't live. This is something that is about to be live, but you'll notice in the top right corner, there's a little toggle here. When you click it, you can now use the site in Spanish. And this should be across the whole site too. So like every piece of the site is translated and should be ready to go. And so that's all I'm going to show for now. It's not live yet, but it is something that will hopefully be live very, very soon. It's like pretty much ready to go.
Yes, we're super excited. Stay tuned. Happy to have any and all feedback. Again, you can contact us at any time. We're super grateful for all of y'all's time and energy and focus today, and look forward to sharing more with you in the very near future.